He had river water on his jacket and a radio in one hand, and he was looking at me like I was either the solution to his problem or the cause of it, and I genuinely could not tell which, and that was the moment, right there, on the Calumet River at 4:47 in the morning, that I understood my life was about to become significantly more complicated. My name is Tavish Moore. I'm 38 years old, and I have been a harbor pilot on the Chicago waterway system for 12 years. That means I board commercial vessels, freighters, tankers, bulk carriers, and I navigate them through the rivers and channels and locks that connect Lake Michigan to the industrial port districts on the city's south side. I do this in fog, in ice, in November gales that make the lake look like something from a different century. I do this in the dark, which is when most of it happens, because commerce does not wait for sunrise. I know the Calumet River the way a surgeon knows a particular procedure, not just the steps, but the feel of it, the specific resistance of each turn, the places where the current does something unexpected, and the places where the bottom is, shallower than the charts suggest, and you need to know. That in your hands before you need to know it in your head. What I did not know, at 4:31 a.m. on a Tuesday in late September, was that a chemical barge moored at the Acme Chemical Terminal on the river's east bank had developed a hull fracture 3 hours earlier, and had been quietly leaking ethylene oxide into the water and the air above it, an invisible, odorless, extraordinarily flammable gas that was, at the moment I was bringing a 580-foot bulk carrier around the bend at 134th Street, drifting southwest on a light wind directly toward my vessel's engine exhaust. The call came from the Coast Guard on Channel 16 at 4:33 a.m. 2 minutes after I had already picked up the anomaly on the air quality sensor, my vessel's chief engineer ran as a personal habit. All vessels Calumet River south of 130th Street. This is United States Coast Guard Sector Lake Michigan. We have a hazmat situation at the Acme Chemical Terminal, Calumet River Mile 3.2. Ethylene oxide release concentration unknown. All vessels hold position immediately. Do not, repeat, do not, operate combustion engines until further notice. I had a 580-foot bulk carrier with a fully loaded engine room, moving at 4 knots toward a cloud of flammable gas. I had approximately 90 seconds to make a decision. What I did next, my chief engineer still talks about it. I killed the main engine. Not throttled down and killed it. Full stop, clutch out, auxiliary systems only. Then I got on Channel 16 and told the Coast Guard exactly where I was, exactly what I was carrying, and exactly how much river I had between my bow and the terminal. This is harbor pilot Tavish Moore, aboard MV Lakeshore Meridian, position Calumet River, mile 3.6, inbound, vessel length 580 feet, loaded grain. Main engine secured. I have approximately 400 meters of river between my bow and your hazmat zone. Current is pushing me south at roughly half a knot. I need a tug or I need a line. What's your timeline on containment? 4 seconds of silence. Then a voice, clear, unhurried, with the specific quality of someone who has trained for exactly this and is now doing it without any of the adrenaline bleeding into their tone. Harbor Pilot Moore, this is Lieutenant Idris Vale, Coast Guard Sector Lake Michigan. We have a response team en route to your position. ETA 7 minutes. Can you hold with anchors? River bottom here is poor holding, I said. Soft sediment. I can deploy, but I can't guarantee it'll arrest drift in 7 minutes. Understood. Do you have a stern line option? I looked at the bank. The east bank had a derelict dock structure about 180 meters back, old enough to be questionable, close enough to be the only option. There's a structure at mile 3.8 on the east bank, I said. I don't know its condition. I can see it from the bridge, he said. It's load-bearing. We use it for training exercises. I'll have a team there in 4 minutes with a line. Can you maneuver on bow thrusters only? Bow thrusters only. No main engine, in a 580-foot vessel on a narrow river in the dark, with half a knot of current pushing me toward a chemical cloud. Yes, I said. Good, he said. And then, before he clicked off, you made the right call killing the engine. That was fast. I did not have time to think about why that particular sentence landed the way it did. I filed it and went to work. It took 11 minutes, not 7. The team arrived at the dock structure at the 4-minute mark as promised. 3 Coast Guard personnel in full hazmat level B gear, moving fast and clean along the east bank with a heavy mooring line. What I hadn't anticipated was that the man running point on the line team was Lieutenant Vile himself. I know this because when my bosun caught the heaving line and the stern was secured, and I finally had a moment to look at the bank. The figure coiling the excess line on the dock was the one who stepped forward, pushed back his respirator hood and looked up at my bridge wing. He was... I need to pause here, because this is the part that doesn't fit neatly into the incident report I filed the following morning. and the incident report is the only document that officially captures what happened that night. He was younger than I expected, early 30s. The kind of face that is completely calm in the way faces are calm when the person has decided that panic is simply not a tool they're willing to carry. His hair was pressed flat from the respirator hood. There was river water on his jacket from the line work, and he was looking up at my bridge wing with an expression that I can only describe as assessment completed, situation manageable, something else noted, filing for later. He keyed his radio. More. You've got about 20 minutes before the containment team has the leak sealed. After that, I need you on the dock for incident debrief. Can you secure the vessel? Securing now, I said. Good, he said again. And looked at me for one more second before he turned back to the line. That one extra second, I noticed it. I don't think he meant for me to notice it. I think he noticed that I noticed. The debrief happened on the dock at 5:22 a.m., by which point the leak was contained, the air quality sensors were reading clear, and the Calumet River had returned to its normal state of being, an extraordinarily hard-working body of water that most Chicagoans have never seen. Lieutenant Idris. Vail ran the debrief the way I imagined he ran everything, methodically, completely with a pad of actual paper on which he made actual handwritten notes, which in my experience is the mark of someone who does not trust the important things to systems that can fail. He went through the sequence. Engine kill decision, timing, bow thruster maneuvering, stern line approach, radio communication. He asked precise questions. He wrote down my precise answers. He did not editorialize. At the end, he looked up from his pad. Your engine kill was 14 seconds after the initial broadcast, he said. He paused. That's fast. I had the air quality sensor anomaly 2 minutes before the broadcast, I said. I was already thinking about it, he looked at me. You picked up ethylene oxide on a portable air quality sensor. My chief engineer runs one as a personal protocol. He's been doing it for 6 years. I've never questioned it. That sensor saved your vessel, he said. The sensor and the broadcast, I said. And the line team. He wrote something down. Then he said, without looking up, You've been on the Calumet long? 12 years on the Chicago system. 8 years regular Calumet rotation. You know this river. Better than most things, I said. He looked up then. What are the other things? It was a strange question for an incident debrief. He seemed to realize this approximately half a second after he asked it, because something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not embarrassment, more like a man who has said something true and is now deciding whether to stand by it or walk it back. He stood by it. Off the record, he said, with the slight emphasis of a man who has just decided to be direct. Chess, I said. I know chess fairly well. The corner of his mouth moved. Just barely. I'll keep that in mind, he said. I thought about that sentence for the rest of the morning. Probably longer. He called 3 days later. Official follow-up, his office to mine, something about the incident report's vessel positioning data. We were on the phone for 22 minutes. The positioning data took 4 of them. The other 18 were, I want to be accurate here, not entirely unprofessional, but not entirely professional either. They occupied a middle territory that I suspect both of us recognized and neither of us named. He asked about the bow thruster maneuvering. I asked about the containment timeline. He asked about the Calumet River's current patterns in late September. I asked about the chemical barge's inspection history. At some point he mentioned that he'd grown up in Duluth on Lake Superior, which explained the water instinct. At some point I mentioned that I'd done my pilot training on the St. Lawrence Seaway before coming to Chicago, which he said explained something about my radio voice, though he didn't specify what. When the call ended, I sat in my office for a moment and looked at the river through my window. The Chicago River, not the Calumet. But water is water. And thought about a man on a dock in the dark who stood by a strange question instead of walking it back. I texted the number he'd called from. The positioning data for the incident report. I can send the full ECDIS log if that's useful. He responded in 4 minutes. That would be helpful. Also, chess. Were you serious? I looked at that for a moment. I'm serious about most things, I wrote back. A pause. Then me too. Good to know. It was not, in any meaningful sense, a conversation about chess. We met for the first time outside of a professional context on a Saturday in October. At a coffee place in Bridgeport that he'd suggested, a neighborhood that sits almost exactly between the Coast Guard station on the north and the Calumet Industrial District on the south. Equidistant between our two worlds, which I did not think was accidental. He was already there. Early, I would learn, was simply how Idris Vael operated. Not anxious early, not performative early, but the early of a man who respects other people's time because he respects his own. He stood when I came in. Not formally, just the natural rising of someone who was raised a certain way and hadn't unlearned it. He was in civilian clothes for the first time. Dark jacket, no insignia, no radio. He looked. I searched for the word while I was crossing the room and found it just as I reached the table. Settled. Like a person who occupies their own presence without effort. Tavish, he said. Idris, I said. We shook hands. His grip was the grip of someone who works with their hands in ways that matter. We sat down. The coffee place was warm and slightly too loud in the good way, the way that gives two people privacy without silence. I ordered. He already had his? How's the river? He said. Quiet, I said. Which means something's about to happen. He smiled at that. A real one, not the almost I'd been cataloging. Lake's been rough this week, he said. November's coming early. It always does in Chicago. Does that bother you? I thought about it. No, I said. I know what November on the lake looks like. I'd rather know a hard thing well than be surprised by an easy one. He looked at me steadily. That's a very specific philosophy. 12 years on the waterway will do that. What else will it do? And there it was again. The question slightly past the boundary of where the conversation was supposed to go, asked with the calm of a man who had decided the boundary was optional. I leaned back. It'll make you very good at reading conditions, I said. At knowing what the water's going to do before it does it. At understanding that the difference between a manageable situation and a catastrophic one is usually about 30 seconds of correct decision-making. And outside of work? He said. Still working on that, I said. He nodded slowly. Like that was, in fact, the answer he'd expected and the one he'd wanted. Like he was also, in his own way, still working on it. We talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I know the exact duration because my parking validation ran out and I had to feed the meter at the 90-minute mark, which required a brief pause in the conversation. And when I came back, he had ordered me another coffee without asking because he'd seen what I was drinking, and it was simply the logical thing to do. That coffee, unrequested and correct, told me more about Idris Vael than 2 hours of conversation had. I just didn't have words for it yet. Those came later. Later was a Tuesday in November. 5 weeks after the incident, 3 weeks after the coffee shop. 1 week after a phone call that lasted an hour and 40 minutes and was ostensibly about updated Coast Guard protocols for chemical barge inspections. We were walking along the lakefront. His suggestion, my agreement, on a morning when Chicago was doing its full November performance, steel gray sky, wind off the lake at 22 knots, whitecaps visible from the path, the kind of cold that has opinions about you. He was comfortable in it in the way of someone raised on Lake Superior, which makes Lake Michigan look manageable. I was comfortable in it in the way of someone who has stood on the bridge wings of vessels and worse. We walked at the same pace, which I noticed because it is not a thing I usually share with people. I walk fast and I don't slow down, and he simply matched it without comment. We'd been walking for about 20 minutes when he stopped. Stopped a half step later. We were facing the lake. The water was doing its November thing. Gray-green, purposeful, indifferent to anyone watching it. The wind was in our faces. I want to say something, he said. Say it, I said. He turned to face me. We were close. The path was narrow, the wind was pushing from behind him, and the physical fact of the space between us was somewhere between 6 and 8 inches, and neither of us had adjusted it. His face was fully in the light. That flat, silver November lake light that doesn't flatter anyone but doesn't hide anything either. And in it he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had decided something and was going to say it completely. I don't do well with halfway, he said. I've tried. It doesn't suit me. So I want to be clear, I've been thinking about you since the dock. Not about the incident. About you. And I'd rather say that directly than spend another 3 weeks pretending the protocol calls are about protocol. The lake moved. The wind pushed. A gull went overhead, making its particular argument with the air. Idris, I said. Yeah. The last 3 protocol calls, I said. I had all the information I needed after the first one. A beat. He looked at me. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise. More like the specific relief of a man who has said a true thing and heard a true thing back and can now stop carrying both of them alone. Okay, he said. Okay, I said. He didn't close the distance. Not there, not yet. But he turned back to the lake and his shoulder came to rest against mine, and we stood like that in the wind for a while, watching the water, and it was the most natural thing in the world. 2 people who knew how to read conditions, reading this one correctly at last. By December, we had a rhythm. His shifts ran irregular. The lake doesn't keep business hours, and neither does whatever a chemical barge decides to do at 4 a.m. Mine were early and long. The overlap was narrow. We used it with the efficiency of 2 people who understand that time is a resource that requires management. He cooked on the nights he was off before midnight. I made coffee in the mornings before he was awake, the particular dark, slightly oversteeped way I'd always made it, and left it in a thermos on the counter, and he'd find it when he got up at 7 and text me one word. Perfect. Every time, without variation, perfect, one word. I kept every one of those texts. We had the check-in by then, the one that happens between people who do dangerous work and have found someone who understands what that means. You okay? I keep being? Me too, it sounds small. Between 2 people who've stood on docks in the dark and made decisions in 90-second windows, it is the entire weight of the thing. In February, there was a second incident on the Calumet. Not a leak this time, but a vessel grounding in ice. A 400-foot tug and barge combination that lost steering in an ice flow and went hard into the east bank 2 miles north of the chemical terminal. Nobody was hurt, but the barge was carrying industrial lubricant and the hull breach threatened a different kind of contamination. His unit responded. I was called in as local waterway consultant because I knew that stretch better than anyone in the response team. We worked the incident for 6 hours. Different roles this time. He was running the waterside response. I was advising on vessel extraction and current management. We communicated through the formal channels, by the book, the way the situation required, professional, precise, correct. But at hour 4, when the extraction plan hit a complication, the ice flow was shifting and the barge was at risk of secondary grounding, and the response team had 90 seconds to make a call. He looked across the operations table at me, not at the charts. At me. More, he said. Push the tug to the port bow, 3/4 power, I said. The ice will give on the north face and the current's been working it for an hour. If you push starboard, she'll go deeper. Port bow 3/4, 15 seconds. He looked at me for 1 second. Then, port bow 3/4, 15 seconds, execute. It worked. Afterward, in the parking lot, gear off, the particular exhaustion of a long, cold operation settling into both of us, he came and stood next to me at my truck. Not close the way we were close on the lakefront, just present. The way he was present. Port bow, he said. Port bow, I said. You knew that without looking at the chart. I've been on that stretch 500 times. He looked at the river, then at me. I trust your read, he said. On the water. On other things. I know, I said. I want you to know that I know you know, he said, which was, I realized, the most Idris Vale sentence I had ever heard, layered and precise and slightly more than it appeared. I laughed. It surprised both of us. Not the laugh itself, but the specific quality of it, the looseness of it, the way it landed between us like something being set down rather than something being released. He smiled. A full one. The real thing. The Chicago cold around us. The river behind us. The city going about its enormous, indifferent business. And the 2 of us standing in a parking lot on the south side at 7 in the morning, smiling like people who had found something they weren't sure they were still looking for. March brought a stretch of mild weather, mild for Chicago, which means the wind only had moderate opinions and the lake was gray instead of black. We started taking the lakefront path on Sunday mornings, a standing thing, unhurried. He'd bring coffee in a thermos. I'd bring nothing because he always had what was needed and had long since stopped pretending otherwise. On the last Sunday of March, we were at the point where the path curves near the Museum of Science and Industry, and the lake opens up to the east and you get the full width of it, Michigan's horizon, flat and immense, The kind of view that reminds you what the city is actually built next to. He stopped. I stopped with him. We stood looking at the water for a while. Lake Superior, he said eventually. What about it? I've been thinking about whether I'd go back, he said. If a position came up? Senior rank, better resources. A pause. I've been offered a preliminary conversation. The lake moved. I said nothing. I wanted to tell you directly, he said. Not after, before. What did you tell them? That I needed some time to think about what I'd be leaving, he said. He looked at me then, fully, the way he did everything when he'd decided something mattered. I know what I'd be leaving. I looked back at him, 8 inches between our faces. The March lake light on both of us, clear and cold and honest. Then you know what I'm going to say, I said. I want to hear you say it, he said. Stay, I said. Not for me and for both of us. Because this thing we've built is worth more than a rank. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he reached over and adjusted my collar against the wind, a gesture he'd made once before, on a different cold morning, the first time he let himself close even that small amount of distance. His hand at my jaw for a moment. His eyes not moving. Okay, he said. Okay, I said. We walked back. His shoulder against mine, the lake beside us, the city ahead. 2 people who read conditions for a living. Reading this one, carefully, correctly, completely. There is a security camera at the Calumet River Incident Command Post, a fixed position camera mounted at the East Bank dock, the one his team uses for training exercises. It was running at 4:47 on a September morning when a harbor pilot and a Coast Guard lieutenant stood on opposite sides of a radio channel and got a 580-foot bulk carrier out of the path of something that could have ended very differently. Somewhere, in that footage, grainy, wide angle, lit only by work lights in the pre-dawn sky, there's a frame of a man on a dock looking up at a bridge wing, and a man on a bridge wing looking down at a dock, neither of them knowing yet. Both of them filing something carefully for later. Later arrived. It always does for the people who are paying attention. The river runs south to the lake. The lake runs to the horizon. The horizon runs to wherever you're willing to go. I know what I'm willing to go toward. I've known since 4:47 in the morning. On the Calumet River, when a man looked up at my bridge wing with a radio in one hand and river water on his jacket, and I filed it, I never did let it go.